MIL-SPEC is a term thrown around quite a bit when it comes to the AR-15, and for good reason. It gives you a set of standards when it comes to the components, parts, and materials used in a rifle in order to meet certain service life and reliability expectations. But just because a rifle has MIL-SPEC parts doesn't necessarily mean it's MIL-SPEC. What do I mean by that? Well, this is a BCM Recce 16, which by all intents and purposes is full of MIL-SPEC parts, components, and materials. Does that mean this is going to perform to the same degree as something like this? A budget-friendly AR stoner build that also has lots of MIL-SPEC parts, materials, and components. Does that mean they're the same exact rifle? Well, here's the thing, and this is where the myth comes from once in a while when it comes to everything that's MIL-SPEC is just the same. Military specification standards don't end at the parts themselves. They also have service life and reliability requirements that require testing in order to find out if you actually meet military specification standards. So what do I mean? Well, there's a torture test that the military does with their rifles, and there's only a certain amount of failures that are allowed during that test to say whether or not that rifle meets military specifications. And there's also certain service life requirements for the small parts in the rifle, and if they don't meet that service life expectation, they also fail. So is your rifle actually military spec? Well, there's really only one way to find out, and this is why you need to be documenting how many rounds you're firing and any malfunctions or issues you have during that course of fire and during the time that you own the rifle. And we're going to talk about all those standards and specifications in detail, so that way you can get an idea as to whether or not your rifle is meeting some of those baseline standards. And if it's not, and you haven't even reached the round count required that the military tests these rifles with, then you should be questioning whether or not your rifle is, well, of the quality you would like it to be. Now, I do want to mention that Midway USA is the biggest supporter of the channel. Thanks to them, I can put videos out like this one, and I can also deep dive into really autistic information that not everybody actually needs, but a lot of us here want. So a big thanks to Midway USA for helping me out with that. Let's get into what those standards and specifications are in the sense of a rifle being subjected to a reliability and functionality test by the military, using the M16A2 as our reference, just because, well, that's the guide that I decided to choose. And then afterward, we can talk about whether or not your rifle will actually meet those standards. So your AR-15 claims to be MIL-SPEC, and all the parts there within are MIL-SPEC, but can it actually function to the standards of military specifications? And the standards I'm referring to today are going to be MIL-R-63997B, which were developed by the military in 1986 and have since been updated, but these standards apply to the M16A2 chambered in 5.56 millimeter. So, what are the standards? What are the acceptable failure rates? Well, according to Table 1 of this form, here's the failure rates that are acceptable in a 6,000 round endurance test. And this is why you need to take logs as to how your rifles are performing on the range so you can verify whether or not you're meeting these standards when it comes to malfunctions and everything else. So, in 6,000 rounds, what's acceptable for the military would be 2 failure of bolt to lock, 2 failure to fire, 4 failure to feed, 2 failure to eject, 3 failure to chamber, 1 failure to extract, 3 bolts fails hold rear, and 0 all other malfunctions. And the total malfunctions combined can be 9. So 9 malfunctions in a 6,000 round endurance test is all that's acceptable. Now, they also have the minimum life of unserviceable parts in rounds. So, what does that mean? Well, here they say that the ejector spring should last 3,000 rounds, the extractor spring should last 2,000 rounds, and other parts should all last 3,000 rounds. Now, what are those other parts? Well, they're shown in note number 3, which says, other parts shall be limited to trigger spring, disconnect springs, hammer spring, extractor pin, and extractor. So of course, during that 6,000 round endurance test, they expect those parts to fail, but those parts need to meet those minimum life of rounds before failing, and then obviously be replaced in order to continue the test. So, can your rifle make it through 6,000 rounds with less than 9 malfunctions, according to all the malfunctions that we just discussed, while also maintaining the parts life of those small parts up to the point where they're expected to fail? Now, Here is what the firing procedure would be for those 6,000 rounds, which I don't expect any of us to do, but this is what the military is doing in order to accomplish these goals. So, firing shall be accomplished in 50 cycles using 30-round magazines. So, 50 30-round magazines. Keep that in mind. One firing cycle shall be as specified in Table 5. Cooling of the barrel shall be to the point that it is capable of being held by the bare hand. Supplemental cooling is permissible in the hand guard area. So this is referring to a lot of things in here regarding select fire and things of that nature that we don't have access to, but just so you're aware, they are letting the barrel cool, but there's no mention of cleaning or maintenance in between other than replacement of parts. And the replacement of parts is referring to those small parts that they expect to fail within this test. And that specifically says, no parts shall be altered during the test. Broken parts that affect function and those parts that are worn to the extent they are unserviceable shall be replaced. The contractor shall provide replacement parts as required to complete the test at no additional cost to the government. So of course, having to switch out extractor springs and ejector springs and things of that nature throughout this process is expected and part of the testing. Now, how do you record the data during such tests, right? Well, this is something that we can do not while we're trying to mag dump 50 30-round magazines, but something we can do while we're taking our rifles out to the range and shooting them is by documenting all the different failures and anything else that we see happening during our time on the range. We can actually see if we're meeting some of these specifications or standards throughout the course of fire, right? So here is how you record the data according to this military document. The following data shall be recorded. Number of rifles tested and number of rifles rejected per shift. Okay, so obviously we're just going to be worried about our own personal rifles we're using. The test data shall be recorded. The ammunition lot number. So that might be actually something to keep track of in case you're buying different types of ammunition. That way, if it is ammunition related, you can verify whether or not you have more ammo of that same lot number. For each rifle that fails, record the following data. So this is something you would probably want to pay attention to in case you're trying to keep track of how your rifle's doing and whether or not it holds up to these military specifications. Number 1, the serial number. Number 2, the type of malfunction or failure, which we'll talk about here in a second. Number 3, the class of malfunction, which is something that you have to be aware of. Number 4, round number at which failure occurred. So keeping track of your rounds before failures is important in the sense of wanting to have all this data as applicable as possible. Number 5, type of firing, semi-automatic or burst. Obviously, we're just worried about semi-automatic generally here in the civilian area. Number 6, round number of magazine at which failure occurred. Now, this is so you can say, okay, on round 12 on this magazine, I had a failure. Well, if that happens again down the road, you could say maybe there's something wrong with this magazine, right? Number 7, the type of magazine used. It says 30-round magazine next to it. Of course, not every magazine you're going to use might be a 30-round magazine, but it is good to know if you're using aluminum mags, P mags, stainless steel mags, whatever it is it might be. And then for the next part of recording data, ammunition defect. Number 1, rifle in which the ammunition defect occurred, and number 2, description of defect. So that way, if you are having malfunctions that are ammunition related, you have that data as well. So what are the different classes of malfunctions? Okay, we talked about the type of malfunctions already when it came to failures to eject, failures to feed, failures for bolt hold opens, and things of that nature. But here are the classes of malfunctions, and this gives you an idea of how you should record this as well because you want to know if you're having catastrophic failures or if you're having easily fixed failures. So, class 1, immediately clearable. Clearable by gunner through operation of charging handle, removal of magazine, or manually removing round without aid of tools or equipment. So that's a class 1 malfunction. Class 2, clearable by gunner with available equipment, basic issue items. So obviously now we're talking about the use of tools if necessary in order to get the rifle back up and running. And then class 3 would be not clearable by gunner. So by the time a class 3 rolls around, it means you have to get your gun fixed in order to move forward. So in 6,000 rounds, is your rifle going to meet these standards? That's a question you can ask yourself. And of course, obviously, these standards are pretty stringent, but they were developed in 1986. We're now benefiting from modern machining and quality control and all these different options when it comes to these types of rifles. So there really shouldn't be a reason to not meet these standards, but here we are. And of course, there's no mention of cleaning or maintenance or anything like that other than replacing parts during this 6,000 round endurance test. Whereas I'm going to say you should be cleaning your rifle intermittently and making sure that it's ready to go, so that way it's got the best chance of possible of defending you and operating properly if you ever need it. So will your rifle make it through that same military testing? Well, you're not going to be able to know that unless you actually keep a log as to how many rounds you're shooting and any of the malfunctions you've had during that time. And of course, also using high quality ammunition from a quality manufacturer, hopefully something more along the lines of military specification, right? But in reality, a lot of people's rifles have probably already had more failures than what the military would allow for in less than 6,000 rounds, which is why I wanted to bring this to your attention. Just because you have MIL-SPEC parts and MIL-SPEC components doesn't mean your rifle is actually meeting those standards once you put it all into testing. And that's why I thought this was worth sharing. I don't have 6,000 rounds on this rifle yet, but I am keeping a logbook, a detailed data log of all the rounds being fired, the type of ammunition being used, and any malfunctions I encounter. And once I hit that 6,000 round mark, well, I should have already had to replace some small parts, right? But I also will know if this rifle is living up to those military specification standards. And if it is, I'm gonna feel really good about getting more BCM products in the future. But this is a good way for you to kind of set a standard, set the bar, and, well, shoot for a goal of at least 6,000 rounds before you want to commit to any particular manufacturer or parts or components or anything else like that. Hopefully this gave you something to think about. I try to put out information like this when I can because I find it to be relevant to the preparedness community, but I also think it's very interesting and that it gives you a different perspective as to whether or not your rifle, just because it has MIL-SPEC parts, is actually going to meet those standards. Anything else you need from me at all, you can go to magicprepper.com. If you want to support the channel directly, you can go to Subscribestar, which is $5 a month. There's exclusive content, preparedness incentives, and a good way to contact me directly there. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.